Welcome to this lecture on the CMOP-E, or the Canadian Model of Occupational Performance and Engagement. So in this lecture, I'm going to start by briefly discussing the historical development of the CMOP-E, and then I'll touch a little bit on some of the key assumptions as well as the underpinning principles that guides us when we're using the CMOP-E in occupational therapy. I will also touch on the different components of this model. So the CMOP-E, this model was developed in 2007, but then it was sort of like the third iteration of the model that was originally developed in the 1980s, which was called the Occupational Performance Model. So you can actually see that from the history of this CMOP-E model, it has been based around occupational performance as a conceptual model in occupational therapy. So from the 1980s, when the occupational performance model was developed, later on around 1997, that's when the Canadian model of occupational performance was then developed, which then evolved to the current CMOP as we know it from 2007. So as we know, with occupational therapy models, most of our occupational therapy conceptual models, they are actually represented by a diagram. So the OPM, or the occupational performance model, in the 1980s, it was basically a simple diagram of three circles, as you can see on the image on the left side. So where the individual was considered to have four aspects, and that was spiritual, physical, socio-cultural, and then mental. And then there was also the second circle, which was around occupation, looking at leisure, self-care, and productivity. And then the outer circle was the environment. And then in the second iteration of this model in 1997, the authors of this model then revised it. And when they revised it, they then came up with the CMOP-E in 1997. There were some few changes from the OPM. For example, if you look at the person represented here as a triangle, they then placed spirituality at the core of the person, and then the component that was considered as mental in the OPM, it then moved on to cognitive. And then there was then removal of the socio-cultural, and then there is the affective in the CMOP, as well as the physical aspect or physical component. The aspects of the occupation, they still remained as productivity, self-care, and leisure. And then there was a slight change as well in the environment, where the CMOP-E ended up having four aspects of the environment. That's the physical aspect, institutional, cultural, and then social. And then later on in 2007, the diagram representing the CMOP-E was then developed. And if you look at that diagram, you will see that it has got two levels. There's part A and then part B. So part A is basically the same as the CMOP, but then there was an addition giving us the cross-sectional view, which is part B, which we'll discuss in this lecture. So what does the CMOP-E do? The CMOP-E helps us to collect and organize information or knowledge, both informal and formal knowledge about the client. And when we're using the CMOP-E, our client can be an individual, it could be a group, it could be a community, or it could be a population. So the CMOP-E also supports professional reasoning and enhances decision making, and the documentation of our decision making by highlighting what we already know about our client and what still needs to be known about their occupational life or occupational profile. And then lastly, the CMOP-E can include the past, the present, and the future aspects of a person's life. So this is quite helpful when we're looking at monitoring progress with our client throughout the therapeutic journey that they will be receiving occupational therapy services. Moving on to the key assumptions, the first assumption is, of course, that human beings are occupational beings. And then the second one is that occupation has therapeutic potential. That's the potency of human occupation, the potential that occupation has to cause changes. The third one, occupation affects health and well-being. So there's that relationship between occupation and health and well-being. When we are enabled to engage in occupations that are meaningful to us, we're bound to have positive health outcomes. And then the next one, occupation brings meaning to life. Of course, we know that meaning of an occupation is ascribed by the doer. The person doing the occupation is the one who ascribes the meaning. But occupation helps bring meaning to our lives. Occupation also helps us organize our time and bring structure to living. For example, for us to have structure for the day, we usually get structure for the day from the things that we do throughout the day. And those things that we do throughout the day are our occupations. And lastly, occupations are idiosyncratic, meaning that we perform occupations as human beings or as occupational beings. We perform occupations in our own unique ways. So they are idiosyncratic. So these are the key assumptions for the CMOP-E. Looking at the principles, the first one is client-centered practice. So this model is heavily focused on client-centered practice. And as you already know, that knowledge in occupational therapy is drawn from different disciplines or different fields. So this model actually draws a lot from the client-centered theories of Carl Rogers in psychology. Occupation, this is another principle. Occupation is the core domain of interest. So this is something that was not clearly highlighted in the previous iterations of the CMOP-E, but with the CMOP-E is clearly highlighted that our domain of interest in occupational therapy is actually occupation. The other principle that is that guides the use of the CMOP-E is the principle of enablement, enabling occupation, where as occupational therapists, we work with our clients, maybe empowering them or we're collaborating with them. We're involved in advocacy, education, adapting situations, adapting the environment, engaging with them. We're designing, we're coordinating, all those aspects, they make up they are underpinned rather by the principle of enabling occupation. And then the fourth one is occupational performance. Looking at the history of the CMOP-E, it was already about occupational performance. So occupational performance remains an important principle within this model. And the key thing for the CMOP-E is occupational engagement. So the E that we see on the CMOP-E is for engagement. So this is a principle that the authors actually realized that what it was missing from the CMOP, and then they revised the model to come up with the CMOP-E. So we'll talk a little bit more about occupational engagement. Now, occupational engagement. Doing an occupation is not enough to conclude engagement, and in fact, may not be required for engagement. So what this is saying is that if a person does an occupation, or if there is occupational performance, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is occupational engagement. If a person is not interested or motivated to do an occupation, or does not find meaning in that occupation, then he or she is less likely to continue performing that occupation. So that's why the aspect of engagement is really important, because doing alone, occupational performance only, is just not enough. The concept of occupational engagement, it broadens the scope of occupational therapy practice to help characterize people's social participation in an occupation, regardless of their capacity to perform that particular occupation. And the authors of the CMOP-E Helen Palatako, they actually gave uh, an interesting example where they spoke about a father and his son participating, or rather engaging in marathon events. The son expressed desires to be part of marathon events, even though he was having severe disabilities and was in a wheelchair and unable to actually run. Or in other words, he was not able to do the running. But then, because the father wanted the son to be enabled to engage in this occupation, they then decided that they were going to participate in the marathon together. So the father was running, pushing his son who was in a wheelchair. So with this example, the authors of the CMOP-E actually managed to put across a point that the son was not he was not running the marathon, but he was fully engaged in the marathon. And that highlights the importance of occupational engagement beyond just occupational performance. So the capacity to perform does not necessarily determine um, engagement in an occupation. Looking at the diagram for the CMOP-E, um, when you first look at it, it sometimes looks complex and confusing, but I'll try to break it down so that we can have a clearer understanding of this model. So this image, that's how it appears in the book, but then this is actually a 3D image. So for me, the easiest way to understand this image is to think of a beggar, in this case, my favorite beggar. So we are having part A for the CMOP-E and then part B. So part A, I would like to think of part A as my favorite beggar. Well, in this case, this beggar, I generated it with AI. So looking at beggar A, it corresponds to image A on the CMOP-E. Now, if we cut this beggar in half, and then we look at the cross-sectional view, it will appear as beggar B. So beggar B is the cross-section, and it's actually showing us that there is a bridge between the two breads, and the beggar patty, or the meat, or whatever it is, fish, or if you are a vegan, just imagine a vegan patty, beggar patty. It represents the occupation. The top part represents the person, and then the bottom part of the beggar represents the environment. So what the occupation does is that it is the bridge between the person and the environment. So if you look at image B on the CMOP-E, the yellow bit, that's the person, the blue bit, that's the occupation, and then the green bit, that's the environment. So as you can see, the occupation, which is the blue part, is the one that is bridging between the person, represented by the yellow, and the environment, represented by the green. And the CMOP-E clearly shows us that our domain of concern as occupational therapists is actually occupation. So that's my way of easily understanding the CMOP-E, or visualizing it in the sense that the cross section just appears as a beggar that has been sliced in half. Moving on to the different components of the CMOP-E, the first one is the person. As shown in the diagram, the person is represented by the yellow triangle, and it has got 4 aspects. There is cognitive, affective, and physical aspects situated at the angles of the triangle, and then at the center, or at the core, there is spirituality. So in the CMOP-E, spirituality is given importance as it is considered the core of the individual, or the core of the person. Now, defining spirituality can be sometimes complex, but what I've done here, I've put together what the different authors have said about spirituality. The authors of the CMOP-E they say spirituality is the essence of the self. Spirituality also relates to an individual's worldview, their personal worldview, how they see the world around them, and how they situate themselves as an individual in that particular world or in that particular context. Spirituality has also been defined as a life force that is pervasive. Pervasive in the sense that it's very difficult at times to explain or articulate spirituality. Unlike the physical aspects that we can see and we can touch, with spirituality, we're not able to do that. Therefore, that can make it a bit complex to explain. It has also been defined as the source of will, self-determination, a sense of meaning, purpose, and connectedness that people experience. So it's about what people experience within the context of their environment. So their experiences, they are not as visible as the physical aspects, if you like. Spirituality is infused through the person, occupation, and environment. It resides in persons and is shaped by the environment and gives meaning to occupation. And this is why the authors of the CMOP-E say spirituality is at the core of the person, because spirituality is the one then where the meaning of the occupations resides. So if it is the one that gives meaning to occupation, therefore it then takes a central role when we're using the CMOP-E. Spirituality involves feelings of connection to something larger than oneself, such as a community or nature or a transcendent being, for example, God, where people believe in God. Spirituality may or may not include religion. So there are different definitions of this particular aspect, and its use in occupational therapy. It's still developing and it's still varied. In some places, it can also be controversial. But in the past about 10 years, there's been a lot of publications about spirituality and occupational therapy, and the reasons why, as occupational therapists, we could be struggling to address this. But the reality is, if we say we are occupational therapists and we're using a holistic view when we're working with individuals, it therefore means that there is need for us to be able to address spirituality because it's part of what human beings experience. It's part of the occupations that human beings engage in. So there's no way we can be holistic without addressing spirituality. And there's lots of literature around that. Yeah, that's another resource that you may want to check if you want. There's a video that I did. It's available on YouTube on my channel, Motivate Otis. I did this video with Professor Mary Ann McCall, and we were discussing spirituality and occupational therapy. And Professor Mary Ann McCall has written a lot on spirituality and occupational therapist. And you can actually visit that link and learn more about how we can apply spirituality in occupational therapy practice. Moving on to the third aspect of the person. And these three, sometimes they are referred to as CAP: cognitive, affective, and physical. So the cognitive aspect, this is mainly looking at components, for example, concentration, memory, perception, judgment, and reasoning. And then the affective, for affective, we're looking at the social and emotional functions, which includes interpersonal and intrapersonal aspects. So those emotions, the mood and things like that, they all fall under the affective. And then lastly, the physical. The physical, it includes the sensory, the motor, and sensory motor functions. Usually, this one is the easiest for people to grasp because it's things that we can see. Then the second component on the CMOP-E is occupation. And occupation is depicted by the blue circular disc between the person and the environment. And like I said before, occupation acts as a bridge between the environment and the person. So it captures all the occupations that compose or comprise of a person's occupational repertoire. By occupational repertoire, we're referring to the constellation of occupations that a person performs or has capacity to perform. So at a given point. So all the occupations that a person is able to perform at one point, all of them, we refer those as the occupational repertoire of an individual. So as we already know, occupational areas general classification is self-care, productivity, and leisure. But for the CMOP-E, you'll see that activities or occupations that are referred to as self-care, it's activities that include things like grooming, dressing, bathing, feeding, toileting, meditation, sleep, and exercise. But you might also see that depending on the classifications in other texts, occupations like sleep, they're actually not classified under self-care. They are classified separately under rest. But for the CMOP-E, they're all these are classified together under self-care. And the second one is productivity, which includes work, whether paid employment or unpaid employment, schooling, attending school, university, college, any form of education, homemaking, and then occupations like volunteering, giving back to the community. It's all part of productivity. And then for the leisure includes occupations like hobbies, games, or recreation to fill up free time, to fulfill cultural or creative interests. So these are sort of like the leisure occupations. But we also know that the classification of occupations is also a little bit controversial, um, because we know that meaning is attributed by the doer. So for one person, and a game that they might be playing, they might consider that to be self-care. So meaning is always attributed by the doer. So, but these categories, they just help us to um, figure out the different occupations that people engage in. But in terms of meaning is attributed by the doer. Now we move on to the environment. For the environment, on the image or on the diagram is the one that is depicted by the green circular disc, as shown by the red arrow. The environment has got 4 components when we're using the CMOP-E, and these components include the physical. So the physical environment, we are referring to all built infrastructure, everything that is built that is man-made. It also includes natural aspects of the environment. For the social aspect involves people in the environment, the relationships and the networks that the client has, or that the client aspires to create. They all form part of the social aspect of the environment. And then the cultural aspect of the environment includes the cultural behaviors, cultural rituals, practices, expectations, as well as attitude of a broader culture. That's the cultural environment. And then lastly, if we're using CMOP-E, the environment includes also the institutional environment. And the institutional environment refers to governmental or organizational structures, the policies and practices in place, systemic practices. It also includes what are called social determinants of occupational engagement. Um, the CMOP-E, when we're looking at its application or its use, there are some tools that have also been developed by the Canadian occupational therapists. Tools, complementary tools that can be used together with the CMOP-E in practice. The first one is the CPPF, which is the Canadian Practice Process Framework, which we touched a little bit on when we were discussing the OT process. And then there's also the CMCE, Canadian Model of Client-Centered Engagement. This is a model which sort of guides the therapeutic interaction between the therapist and the client. And then, of course, we also have the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure. So the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, we are going to touch on it when we talk about the different assessments or outcome measures that we use in occupational therapy. So these the references that I've been using, and thank you very much.